So I am a senior sales engineer at Periscope Data, which was recently acquired by Sisense, which means I'm going to be calling myself a Sisense employee. But if you're not familiar with them, we are a SQL, Python, and R workflow tool. And so what we'll be talking about today are a few of the trends that we see in the data landscape. So one of the pieces that's been most fascinating about my job is we get to talk to thousands of companies and how they use data, and ultimately what are the trends we're seeing in terms of being able to be a lot more robust with how they tackle data problems. So you can see a lot of the trends in the industry moving deeper and deeper into a more technical skill set. So hopefully something that, as everyone in the room here knows, Python, as well as, honestly, there's a lot of value that we can see in a few of the upstream tools as well. SQL has been a core workflow piece of Periscope for a couple reasons I'll go into in a bit, as well as some of the things that we see in terms of the way in which people are forming teams around data problems. It's a pretty interesting process. People, when they see data problems, will jump to like an ML AI is solving the world's problems. But then we can hedge back and actually start to be able to talk a bit about how can we see people maturing to those problems and what is the value in each one of those steps. So to give you a bit of background in terms of where we've played and how we've ultimately been able to see some of these trends, Periscope, the company, has historically been able to be across the whole data stack. So by that I mean working on ingestion problems, working on warehousing problems, transformations, visualizations, and ultimately one of the pieces that oftentimes is undervalued in the technical side, which is the communication layer. And so being able to have all of those pieces wrapped up into one platform has given us a really clear sense of how are people being able to actually get action from data, and ultimately the insights that are driving businesses and the workflows that they use to get there. So as I mentioned, one of the things that we play in is the data space, and ultimately when you're thinking about data, there's usually a front end of data. So when people see us, they see us as a visualization tool. What ultimately they're not seeing behind the hood here is that we often have gotten into a much more complicated sphere where data problems aren't necessarily able to be tackled by your traditional Tableau, or honestly, how many times I see Excel for people who are doing their workflow tools once they're actually doing some data problems. And instead, what we ultimately are trying to offer is a few different layers here. And the first piece that we built out as a platform is SQL. And so as this community here may be very familiar, SQL could be a very limited layer, but there are some trends in terms of data infrastructure that I'll go into in a bit that are actually very important to note so that you can see SQL not necessarily as a very niche grab my data type of tool and as more of a core component into being able to tackle data problems at scale. But one of the other pieces in why we're here today is to be able to also talk about how Python fits into that workflow. And this isn't Python in terms of being able to write 1,000 lines to be able to have some cool ML thing do all of the workflow of your whole company. It's really being able to be very targeted with the usage of Python as a way to be an additional wrapper layer around your data problems. And then what are the different types of pieces that you're ultimately able to tackle in the Python layer, the SQL layer, or ultimately when you're deploying the communication and visualization components as well. So to take us a step back, one of the things, as I mentioned, that's been really valuable to me in my role has been being able to just talk to a large number of teams. So when we go out and talk in the data space, we're talking to people who are looking at being able to have a very visual heavy way of being able to explore data. And by that, I mean something that's like a drag and drop layer. You never see a single line of code. It's all handled in the back end. People don't necessarily have to grapple with it. And then we see people migrating deeper and deeper in terms of skill set for a few core reasons. But what we ultimately have here is what we call a data team maturity curve that we've been able to really push. And the data team here is going to be a centralized team. And the reason being is, as I mentioned, traditional BI is only able to tackle so much. And honestly, the even bigger problem is traditional BI has been a very much hand-off process. So when we're talking about being able to equip you all to be able to run full stack data analysis, it's something that when you are using some other tools or you have a disparate workflow, you've got people exchanges, and ultimately those are going to be some of the biggest difficulties you deal with. And so one of the reasons that Periscope as a company came about, and then ultimately Sisense really caring about us and acquiring us, is because we see you all as ways to being able to engage with data in a much richer format. And by that, it's a little bit of a nuance in terms of what you're ultimately able to do, especially when we go out and talk to someone like a CMO who may not understand all of the complication that goes into data problems today, or all of the complication that you can bring to the table. But really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to drive as a result of being able to form these teams is better decisions. So actually getting information in front of either your customers to be able to understand that they can also buy another product, or being able to get something in front of your salesperson to know who to call next. They can also tackle big problems, so being able to go in, and a lot of the trends we see in the data infrastructure side allow us to be able to go and scan across billions of records in a trivial amount of time because of things like BigQuery, Snowflake, Redshift, just doing the Lord's work for us in terms of actually grabbing that data. And then last but not least is the ability to answer really hard problems. So these aren't necessarily something where you want to be able to calculate how much revenue do I have over time, but you ultimately get in and start to look at the intricacy of what are the revenue drivers and how do we ultimately map those in a way where our teams can understand and ultimately act on. So this slide here helps to show just a handful of the things that the modern data analytics team is able to do. And when we say data analytics, we're focusing on SQL plus a light layer of Python. This isn't something where you have a very robust ML infrastructure side. This isn't something where you have the data scientists going in and doing some really sophisticated analysis. It's just a progression towards those processes where teams are able to extract value from the data they're getting today by putting it through a more sophisticated layer of transformations to define business rules or create something that ultimately is the place people go to for metrics. One of the things that I keep hearing and thinking about recently is the importance of how much your metric is tailored to your needs. And there's a lot of pieces that go into that. So all of the, honestly, end of the list of these things go into how do you make something that is tailored specifically to someone's need and gives them the insight they need. So from that, we're ultimately able to start to think about it in terms of a stack. So the data maturity curve is something that my company really pushes as a result of the fact that we see people trying to jump to the very end where they just come in and they say, give me ML, I want to be able to predict all of how my revenue is being able to be driven, and I think it's these 10 factors. And honestly, the number of people who come in from like a sales team who don't know anything about ML, they don't know anything about Python, they're not ready for that type of workflow. And they also don't have the type of people who are able to do that workflow. So what we oftentimes have to do is have them take a step back, be able to really understand where are you at in terms of being able to establish the metrics that could go into something like some ML algorithm or something that will ultimately be able to get you incrementally better towards being able to make data-driven decisions or have some sort of insight into what you should do. So we see people moving from some basic SQL, some definitions that do grab you that revenue, to a bit more abstracted SQL. One of the things that may be interesting for the room is just the fact that there are a lot of people creating extensibility around SQL. One of the things you may want to look into if you haven't already is an open source tool called DBT. It's honestly been one of the coolest things that our company has been able to interact with, and we love talking to the company that basically curates that product in the open source world. And they really allow you to be able to abstract SQL and make it a lot more extensible by having Jinja and other types of syntax involved. And then once you've gotten that central source, then we move into being able to have Python for some supported workflows that those are able to offer that we can't get in the core SQL layer just because databases don't do fancy stats, which honestly is what most of us boil down to. So one thing I also want to be able to talk about, since this is a very Python-heavy room, is just where do we see SQL versus Python? For a fun backstory, I sat next to a woman who actually graduated with a master's in data from Stanford, and she used to run select stars out of every single database that she was operating in, and that would ultimately be the thing she dropped into like a Jupyter notebook to be able to actually do her work. One of the pieces that she really misses as a result of that workflow is the huge amount of work that can go into data problems from the SQL layer. So it can do a huge amount of grabbing of your data and doing some light transformations, doing logical conditions to subset your data, and just be able to get you reduced down from maybe billions of records down to a few 100,000 that actually are meaningful to your workflow. And then from there, what we often see our customers doing is using Python or R in our product. I'll talk about Python for the most part, but we also support R to be able to do some last mile tailoring. So there are a few different core use cases to those pieces. But really, at the end of the day, I hope that you guys see some value in SQL so that you're able to actually start to incorporate a little bit of that coding as well. So with that, one of the pieces that we often see as like an ideal workflow is being able to extract a huge amount of data, do processing in the SQL database, analyze it really robustly in Python using a lot of tools to be able to explore the data or to be able to transform the data, and then ultimately being able to visualize and share. One of the things that I see undervalued in the technical community is just the communication with another person. I have this as a comment a lot when we're talking to the data teams we talk to today, and it's really just the fact that who's making the decision really needs to be brought in, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's not going to be someone on the data team who's going to do the sales call or doing the giant strategy overview or update for the COO or something. It really is their ability to communicate the insights that they get through an effective visual, or in the worst case scenario, just typing it out in text and saying, here's the core insight, that allows them to be able to actually share their work and be able to get value from it. One other piece that's really interesting that we see as a trend as well is being able to store that data back into a data warehouse for other purposes. So not just running an algorithm on the fly, but actually doing some processing and storage so that it can be used for other purposes, such as driving an application. Or honestly, we also store it just so it can be served up faster when someone wants to query that same data set, but after it's gone through a SQL and Python transformation. One thing to also note in terms of where a lot of value comes into play is being able to make this a very iterative process. If you haven't done data science yet, honestly, the amount of times that you go back to the drawing board and try and iterate on your core data, by that I mean like the data set you've abstracted or been able to actually grab from your database, and then all of the different transformations. You really are dealing with an iterative problem to be able to finally get to something worth sharing out to the rest of your team. So just to really reinforce and hammer home one last time, there is a lot of cool stuff that's happened in data infrastructure that allow us to be able to, honestly, Periscope's basically ridden this wave. It really is based off of the fact that warehouses are cheap and powerful today in a way that they haven't been before. So if you stand up a Postgres instance versus standing up a Snowflake's something that's trivial to just pay them a bit of money and they can store stupid amounts of data because they just pass through cost whatever it is on Amazon, and then to be able to access it with whatever level of computing power that you want. And it's great to be able to do some things here, especially aggregations over large amounts of data, so being able to subset it and then passing that subset to Python, your SQL layer is going to run a lot faster. You're also able to join data in unique ways and then be able to do some simple transformations. But also thinking about it in terms of wide tables, really, because one other trend that's interesting is a lot of columnar store is the way to go. Because we want to only tap into a few columns when we're actually accessing data. And then that will allow us to be able to just grab 1 and 10, or honestly, some of our biggest customers, I think Uber has like stupid wide tables with thousands of columns, just because you can grab, here's my ID, and here is the exact thing I need for my metric across a huge set of data. And then they just create ELT or ETL systems to make those really wide denormalized tables with all of the metrics they need across all of the different whatever dimensions that you have within that infrastructure. So last, but why you're actually at a conference. So Python here, just to give you a few of the use cases we see most commonly across our customer base. Advanced transformations, this is, as I mentioned, something to not be undervalued. Being able to load your data in with transformations, or being able to load the data and then transform and then load the data again. We see teams doing this process so many times as they go through an entire data stack, and I'll give them another plug. DBT allows you to do this at a level that is just unparalleled. But that really allows you to do the pivoting, cleaning, or when we start to talk about applying machine learning layers, complex analysis with statistics, being able to append data that didn't exist before. Honestly, that is just a huge amount of value add because you're going to make a better decision most likely with statistics than someone's gut. And that's what we're often competing against in terms of the data community. And then finally, the last piece here is my personal focus of a lot of my time, just really being able to visualize data in the right way. So making sure that what we've created is actually something that's easy to read and is able to be actually communicating as a layer without me having to go and talk to someone and say, hey, look, this dot over here is the important one. This is going to mean that we make $1 million more if you actually looked at that one versus these 10 others. So really being able to go in with these tools, Python allows you to get very granular with how you create those types of visualizations and allows you to do the types of things like highlighting bars or other types of metrics that really are transformative in terms of someone either completely misunderstanding or truly understanding what you've got. So with that being said, we do have, I mean, honestly, I'll pop open the editor and everyone can just see a quick demo of what this means. When we're talking about Periscope as a platform, what we really have done is allow you to be able to use your core coding workflows to be able to quickly spin up a communication layer. So as I mentioned, being able to just query data, I've put in a few sample queries here that just highlight a few of the capabilities of these languages themselves, and then talk a bit about how they actually translate to insights. So if I want to be able to go in and actually start to be able to create some calculations, being able to just say how many users do I have, or being able to do that with a bit of logic involved is really going to be able to start to move people down that first step of what are some of the core metrics that drive my business. Being able to do that in SQL is probably your best bet just because it is going to do that light aggregation, as I mentioned. And then as we move to being able to do more and more sophisticated workflows, one of the other pieces, as I mentioned, is doing a ELT layer. So that's something that a lot of people, when they hear it, may not actually understand what the processing is going into it. But essentially, it amounts to the fact that when you're doing data problems, they can become really complex in terms of the logic and the calculations. And that means that it's going to take a lot of time. So being able to move instead of from I'm calculating stuff on the fly to I am calculating and storing that is a really transformative process in terms of the actual runtime of a lot of these systems. For us, we've done that with the coding environment, as I mentioned, and this can be done in SQL or Python to be able to store that back into your infrastructure. I was calculating this yesterday because we're really starting to create the success metrics for our customers around this functionality. And some of our customers are running things like 800 times for a given chart. Each one of those runs could have been 4 minutes of process time, but with storing and actually grabbing it from that stored data instead of grabbing it live from the source with all that logic, ended up saving them like 50 hours a week just for a single chart in terms of processing time. With concurrency and things, you can do some fun stuff there, but no one wants to wait for data for 4 minutes. And everyone in this room would probably be all right with it just because we understand code takes time. But honestly, you throw that in front of anyone else at your company who doesn't understand any sort of technical capabilities, and they basically just bounce because no one's got time for that. The last thing that I do want to highlight here is just the ability to add on a very light ML layer. When people say, I want to be able to do forecasting, I want to be able to understand and cluster my customers by unique features, it's really just them trying to be a bit more sophisticated in their work. They don't need you to have 100% accuracy. They just need you to have better than a guess accuracy. And that is pretty transformative as you start to think about these things, only in so much as there are some super simple libraries to basically just click and import, apply a bit of transformations, and ultimately deploy with very little effort from your end. You can basically go in and create these nice little fancy forecasts. And if you show this to your finance team, they're going to have their jaw drop. But really, at the end of the day, all that we're doing within this specific workflow is, as I mentioned, doing aggregations as we grab the data from the SQL layer. So just grabbing it up on some level of aggregation. The actual query here is just grabbing it by day and saying sum of our price. And then once we move into our actual coding environment, the pass off of that data frame, the big thing here is we're just importing profit from Facebook. And thank you to them for making this amazing library. Plus, we use Plotly in order to be able to visualize it in between those two with some simple, just honestly, most of this is just doing some checks, since we wrote a pretty robust script around being able to do it on any level of aggregation, and also if you didn't pass in the right data. But really, the output here is just a very simple regression on top of that system. And by simple, I mean it was simple to implement, but complex in terms of what's going on behind the hood. It's just nice because you don't actually have to have spent all of that data science learning time. You just have to understand a few core principles, apply the framework, and then be able to have the output be passed off to any of your end users. And so if you're able to just think about things as a lot more simplified in terms of how you need to ultimately approach these problems, you can make it so that you can tackle hundreds of these in a given year, just because you're just going in and finding little opportunities to make decisions using stats in a way that's better than someone's gut. So just to wrap up here before we have a couple questions, a few of the trends that I mentioned are really just around the data teams themselves are a thing. A lot of people may not necessarily think in this room that that's a big trend, but people interacting with data have historically interacted with it on your spreadsheets or in your basic BI tools and actually haven't touched it with code. And so you're really able to do some things within the coding environments that are transformative to the company that they may not have thought about today. So you leverage SQL, leverage Python for those. SQL specifically able to do a lot of work in terms of grabbing data, Python to do a lot of work around that data that's been grabbed. So transformations, complex analysis, custom visuals. So with that, I can open it up to some questions. We can talk about pretty much anything you guys want.
Yeah, so there's 2 microphones, one for each side of the room. So raise your hand, we'll take you in order. We have a little bit more time than usual. We end here at 3:20. So any questions? I'll play the Jeopardy music.
We've got one in the back behind you.
Behind you.
You mentioned SQL, but any interactions with NoSQL or any connections with NoSQL?
So one of the things that we basically a better company on is not really interacting with NoSQL. It's a very complicated problem. They have SQL-like interfaces that we could connect to, but just as a core company tenant so far, we haven't. Most of the time, the reason being is that businesses don't change forms that much. Like, your finance team doesn't want to have some JSON blob that they're trying to extract revenue from. The revenue comes in the same way every time. They want dates and prices. So at the end of the day, once we start to hit some of those more structured business models, then the data ends up becoming structured also as a result. And since it's structured, it's just much better as a SQL versus a NoSQL. But when we see companies coming in when they're a lot more technically driven, they have been having to define and pivot their company a bunch of times. They do have a NoSQL database, but oftentimes people will actually go through the trouble of going from like a Mongo to some sort of SQL interface just because, as I mentioned, their business has taken shape. It's just that their application infrastructure doesn't necessarily have, has not historically had that shape. So they just go in and transform the data as necessary.
Yeah, hi. So I don't come from I guess a standard business intelligence background, so I'm a little curious to know, like, how much has Jupyter do you think penetrated like the information space, the BI space?
So that's an interesting question. So we, on our team, as well as another one of our competitors, Mode, actually are starting to integrate Jupyter Notebooks because it's a workflow tool. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about being able to have business intelligence, really how I've defined that through my career within the space has been, how do you start to communicate those insights out? So if I have a Jupyter notebook sitting on my computer, I can't actually email that to my CEO. I can email screenshots. I can't have him update the code behind the system because he probably doesn't have Python installed, unless you have a technical CEO, in which case, power to you. But for the most part, when we're talking about most companies, you can't actually distribute a Jupyter notebook around the teams. You can do it within the core data science team. It's a fantastic tool. We have things that we've used to mimic it. Really, at the end of the day, it's just a really nice way to iterate on your data. But I can't say it enough. It doesn't matter what we learn. It matters what ultimately gets acted on. And there are a lot of times where I've known something because I've interacted with the data, but failed to tell someone who's actually making the decision, here is what the data says. So Jupyter is great, but it's on your local computer, and you've got like 15 versions of the same file. So there are a lot of things that could be iterated on in that tool. Yeah.
My question was, in this tool, do you allow certain users to have the ability to run these queries and publish them, and certain users only to have the ability to just view the charts and stuff like that?
So they're able to view the charts. They're able to click a refresh button.
Okay.
And that, because of the way we've integrated our systems together, is really powerful because we're essentially allowing anyone to run Python. You can click a refresh button. We'll rerun grab the newest data, because that's a very core, important part of the process, and then run it through the same script. And by having that sort of repeatable layer where essentially anyone can interact, we've got some dynamic components built in so you can be able to change out and look at customer 1 or customer 2. So some of those scaling pieces. But ultimately, it amounts to the fact that like anyone can click a refresh button and have access to those scripts.
Okay, I guess that's it. I guess Britton was sticking around for a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, I heard there may be dessert.
All right.
I'm not too sure, but
All
I'll
right.
be over at the dessert
is
tables.
in various places outside.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.